I've got the great pleasure to have Jade LEUNG. She is the head of research and partnership at Center of the Governance AI in UK, particularly in the Oxford University. Thank you very much, Jade, for being on the mic.
My pleasure.
We want to address something which is particular according to AI today. We used to implement AI in financial industry, in insurance, and so to have tools to better understand the behavior of people, to score, to provide them better services, much more personalized services. And the other side, we have talked very few about the scoring of the tools itself. What do you think, and what is your approach, Jen, on this subject?
So if I understand the question, it's something like how do I think about the importance of scoring artificial intelligence tools that we're using today? And I think it's a really important question. We need a lot more done on what we think as a society makes for a good system, and makes for a system that you can measure is reliably going to deliver what you want it to deliver. And so in the financial sector, in the healthcare sector, you see a lot of AI being used already. And it's sort of terrifying that a lot of those systems haven't been scored or standardized in any way. And so the importance of being able to measure what we think makes for a safe system, and then being able to translate that into things like scores, and hopefully at some point scores will feed into certification systems, licensing systems, which will help us as a society trust that these systems are doing what we want them to do. I think that in general is a very important set of things to do.
Do you think that now we need a third party to investigate, to make a neutral, like a neutral agency, but big company have and want to protect their asset, because their asset now are data and the machine, the engine.
Sure. Yeah. A third-party institution, I think, has always been helpful in any industry that we've tried to regulate. So I wouldn't be surprised if we actually needed it in the case of AI. So for example, if you look at the financial industry, there are a lot of third-party regulators, third-party auditors, who critically aren't governments. So governments have sort of delegated that to third parties. And those third parties are really important to hold checks and balances in place for some of these private companies to operate. So I think that seems important, and that seems plausibly good. You don't see any of those exist at the moment. And so there could be a lot of work done to set up things like third-party checks and balances and third-party auditing systems.
What will be the profile of the people, of these people in the agency? Because we have to avoid bias, but we have also to avoid you don't be judge and party.
Yeah.
So your background has to be a broad discipline.
Yeah.
You have to be competent not only in the regulation and law systems, but in political implementation, in the tech side, of course, but not only social human science and so.
Yeah, such a good question. And you've pointed out all the things that I think are important for these people to be. I think it's probably most important for them to understand the technology well. And you see a lot of policymakers currently struggling to do good policy making because the technology systems are so complex.
Do you think that the policy makers, politicians themselves, who have to engage in this field, have not about the background, but the information, the knowledge to understand what are the good questions to ask rapidly, and to make the implementation as well?
For sure. Yeah, and I think policymakers should be encouraged to do a lot more of that kind of work and that kind of questioning. I think it's also unrealistic to expect every politician is going to understand the technology well. And so another thing that I would encourage is for politicians in political systems to draw on domain experts more. So to draw on technical experts, bring your leading AI engineers into the room and have them shape the policies with you so that they can help you by delivering their expertise to the table. And I think that's a really important thing, is to collaborate more with technical experts and also have them have ability to shape what you're doing. That kind of cooperation I'd love to see more of.
Let's talk about from the microscopic, the ground, and the very important issue on the ground there is about a macroscopic view.
Yeah.
There is a complete asymmetric framework, not only about the regulation, now there is a GDPR in Europe, but asymmetric influence between big techs, because big techs are in such kind of area in the world,
Sure.
and there is also the rest of the world. How can we cope with this complete asymmetric of the power?
That's a tricky question. So I think we're living in a time where companies are more powerful than they have been for a long time. I think there's a couple of things that come to mind that seem important to point out. One is that there's an opportunity for us as users of the technology, for the public, to turn our eye now towards these companies and say, you guys have a lot of power. It's your turn to be responsible. And you have to understand that with power comes, great responsibility, right? And so being able to turn the focus away from governments, not necessarily away from governments, but more towards companies, I think is one thing that's important. The other is that I think we often talk about the fact that companies are becoming so much more powerful than governments. I think that is sort of a misconception to some extent. You still have very powerful governments, and we often forget that governments have been around for a lot longer than these companies have. And so they have legal tools, they have national jurisdiction, they have a democratic authority, in democratic countries anyways, where that gives them power that companies will never have. And they can constrain the actions of companies if they want to some extent. So I think the misconception that governments are entirely powerless is a thing that's not true in my view. And so I think it's more actually a question of balancing the goals of these two very powerful actors. On one side you've got firms, on one side you've got governments, and both of them are powerful in different ways. And then sometimes they want to work together and sometimes they don't. And understanding how that relationship works, I think, is actually more the question.
Last but not least, there is also the cultural framework. There is regulation, laws, asymmetric with players, but the cultural aspect. Because implementation of all these tools depends on the cultural adoption. In some area, it could be very easy to adopt the smartphone and the usage of the smartphone, and to avoid, not about bias, but to avoid side effect. For people, it's not side effect. It's just the way they think and they live. It's not a problem. In other area in the world, it's a problem. So there is also an asymmetric of the cultural adoption.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think we often don't talk about that enough. Particularly the West doesn't talk about it enough, in that understanding that it's not just about the US and China, which is what a lot of people always talk about, but there are a lot of other relevant countries, a lot of other relevant peoples that aren't being included in this kind of conversation. That's an important fact for sure. I don't really know what the answer is to solve that, aside from just acknowledging that there's a concentration of power at the moment, and that with that power comes the responsibility of knowing that it's both a global challenge, a global opportunity, and so you need to have a kind of global table where you've got people around.
Sure. Thank you very much, Jade, for this insightful sharing, and hope to have you soon on the mic.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.